Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well, Rory. I'm even rubbing my hands together this morning. I'm glad to be here, and we are glad that you have joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. It's episode 222, or musically put, 222.
Dun, 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 dun.
Hey, and we have three topics that we're going to be covering today. We're going to be starting off in our Counselling Foundations. This is when we go back to the foundations that are so important that underpin any counselling practice. And today we're looking at counselling and the law. We then move on to that focus on self, where we recognise that you are the heartbeat of your practice. We need to look at ourselves. We need to be okay in ourselves to be there for our clients. And today we're going to be looking at creating a safe emotional space for our clients. And then focus on, that is focus on self. Moving on from focus on self, he should say, putting his teeth back in, we go into practice matters, where we dip our toe into any aspect of practice. It can be the business of running a practice. It can be the paperwork. It can be what we may get presented with in practice. And today we have an expert lecturer. It's Amy Launder speaking about time-limited counselling. And I think this is gaining so much popularity, specifically when funding and budgets are low. Time-limited counselling, or if the clients just don't have the time to be able to commit to many weeks or maybe even months of therapy. So that is in Practice Matters. But we start by visiting those counselling foundations, and we look at something that is so important, and it's going to be different depending on where you are based in the world. Now, we're based in the United Kingdom, so we work under the legislation of the United Kingdom, but we're speaking about counselling and the law because it plays such an important part.
Yes, I mean, it came as a bit of a revelation to me when I went to training, and this came up because it's something that I really never considered. I believe that counsellors were somewhat akin to priests or vicars who listened to people, and everything was said was kind of sacrosanct and confidential. And in fact, there are some exceptions to, and as Ken said, the UK law that we need to think about, but we also need to think about law in general. Counselling in the law isn't just about the exceptions to confidentiality; it's the laws we work to and we have to abide by. And of course, one of those laws is the General Data Protection Act of 2018. We need to protect clients' data. We need to do due diligence to make sure that confidential information, be it stored on paper or on your phone or on your electronic device, is secure and doesn't get into the public domain. And for those counsellors who are qualified colleagues, there is a kind of expectation that they'll register with the Information Commissioner's Office. You have to pay a small fee, and that you will abide by that law. So I think when we think of counselling in the law, there's lots of different laws we have to think about. And of course, another one would be health and safety legislation. If we're working in our own home, and the client comes in, we'd have to make sure that our house was safe for somebody to be in. We want someone tripping over something or maybe being electrocuted, switch a light switch on and it was faulty. So those are some of kind of laws, I think, that sometimes go under the radar, Ken.
Yes, and I'd like to add into that the Equalities Act, where we are seeing all people as human beings on this fellow journey with us and not discriminating. And I think that the legislation is generally there for very good reason. It's from where things have gone wrong or where people have been discriminated against and pain has been caused that Parliament meets and they create laws to how we work ourselves around that. Now, the interesting thing is when we look at legislation is not a nice to have. It is an imperative. It's not an ethical imperative. It is a legal imperative. And we don't get a choice in it. And not understanding the law or not knowing that the law exists, unfortunately, is not a defense for not following the law. That's one of the things about the law is you can't, well, I didn't know that I needed to protect the client's data. I didn't know that I needed to register with the ICO. There is still going to be an outcome to that. So it is not a defense to go, well, I didn't know that existed. And I think as practitioners, we are in a profession. This is a profession. And in a profession, going back to the original meaning, we profess an oath. We are held to standards, and part of those standards is that we have an understanding of what the law is. And of course, when you study counselling formally, you will go through the law, but that is the law at that time. And we speak so often about our CPD, our continuing professional development. It is up to us to keep an eye on any changes within legislation so that we are aware of it, so that we can integrate that into our practice if need be. And I think that it's interesting because it's reading government websites and looking at the law is not the most fun thing, and it's maybe not even on the radar for so many. But it's so important. We have to. We're called on by the law and by our profession to do so.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that hopefully those colleagues who are student colleagues who are working in placements, their placements should take care of this within the contract, because I think it's apt to say at this point, Ken, that any laws need to be in the contract so the client can make an informed decision. Now, things like health and safety legislation, I don't think would make it into a contract, but certainly things like general data protection, and saying that, you work under the general data protection regulations and how a client's data is stored. And there are some specific laws that we need to think about. And I'm just going to have a look at my handout here, which we'll share with you. I'll give you details of that a little later on in the podcast. So the Terrorism Act, money laundering regulations, money laundering, terrorist financing and transfer of funds regulations, and the Drug Trafficking Act. These are all exceptions to confidentiality. Now, what I would say is that, generally speaking, it's very unlikely that a client would actually disclose terrorism. However, it's very possible that the relative of a client you're seeing, so you're seeing a client and one of their relatives may be involved in terrorism. And I was very interested to learn when I was training that the reason this was put in was for the time when there was a very difficult time in Northern Ireland. Some people could still say there's difficult times in Northern Ireland. And therapists were working with clients whose relatives may have been in prison for terrorist offences, and something was discussed, maybe at a prison visit or maybe within the family, and it put an onus on the therapist to have to disclose it, and that's the real history of it. So those should be in the contracts, and I think it's important that anybody who is writing a contract has an understanding of what the laws are, and crucially, what do you do if you believe somebody has broken these laws? I think that's an interesting one. Do we run out of the therapy room and call the police immediately? What do we do in these cases, Ken?
Well, I think that this just highlights the importance of that contract and the importance of laying this information out before you get into any client material, and having informed consent on that contract, having a signature or some indication that you can evidence back to that the client has agreed to the information that has been shared. And this is a great case in point that you mentioned now, Rory. So if I'll tell you how I am on this. If I was in a session and somebody mentioned that they were involved in or had knowledge of an act of terrorism, then I think that it would be safe to say that me making any mention of the fact that I was going to pass this information on because I have to break confidentiality, because I am required to by legislation, could put my life at risk, and it could put my family's life at risk, because it may trigger a stop. No, we don't want this information out. And when we're speaking about an act of terrorism, we are talking about organized individuals that have significant resources around them. So I wouldn't be mentioning it in the session. And the reason I wouldn't be mentioning it in the session is because I would have outlined this in the contract. It would have been mentioned before we started our client engagement. And in my contract, I'm not reading from it now, so I'm speaking just from memory. It goes along the lines of, I would need to break confidentiality if you were to mention knowledge of or involvement in an act of terrorism. Full stop. I then go on to say, I would not in our session discuss this with you. It is discussed in this contract. I would then just need to report that on without even telling you. And again, full stop. And again, I'm just kind of paraphrasing from memory what is in that contract. We need to look to our safety and the safety of our family in those kind of situations. But if you've covered that in your initial contracting, then surely the individual, you would cover it in your contract, you would check the understanding of your contract with that person before any client engagement starts. They then have the boundaries of the session. They know what will happen if they do bring that information because you've already shared that with them. I don't know what you would do, Rory.
Well, I mean, I think exactly the same thing. In a very unlikely event that's a client disclosed that, you know, that they're involved in or have been involved in an act of terrorism, I think I'd go along the lines of your thinking, Ken. My view would be that, you know, I've outlined the contract, that I've checked their understanding of the limits of confidentiality, and then I could take a view of what to do. And I think the one that used to come up a lot for students was the Drug Trafficking Act.
Oh, yes.
And there's a bit of a debate here. Drug trafficking is the movement, as far as I understand it, of huge amounts of drugs. It's not somebody selling, you know, a little bit of, shall we say, a little bit of cannabis, which is illegal. Let me be really clear on that. Making no judgments on this, but it is illegal. So I think you have to use a little bit of wisdom on this. There's a big difference between someone, you know, selling a, you know, half an ounce of cannabis and someone importing a wagon load of cocaine. I think that it is there is a difference. And also, you're going to be able to draw where you can, if it's not an emergency situation, on your supervisor and the ethics hub of your ethical body. That's why it's so important to be a member of an ethical body. It's one of those reasons what you pay your money for, because you can contact the ethics hub and talk it through with someone, and they can give you a view. They don't tell you what to do, but they can give you a perspective, and from that perspective, you then have to make a decision. I'd also like to point out that there are some glaring omissions from the legal confidentiality. One is disclosing harm to children, because as we stand in the UK at the moment, and I think a lot of people, we've talked about this on the podcast before, there is no statutory legislation for an independent practitioner, I'm going to make this really clear, to disclose harm to children. If you're working within a school or you're working within a setting that looks after children, then it's covered under the Children's Act. So a lot of therapists like myself have an overarching part of the contract that says harm to self or harm to others.
Yeah. And
I think that's really, really important. I learned that very early when I was a placement counsellor, and they used to have it on the walls of the therapy room when I worked at Mind, I seem to remember, disclosure of anything that's harm to self or harm to others. And that was a big relief, because it meant it took the burden of the decision from me. I was working under the organisation, and that was the organisation's policy. And I took that into my own private practice when I went into private practice. Because what happens if you had a situation where you had a client who turned up under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and he knew they were driving a vehicle? You know, my personal view would be, if somebody, I would ask them, you know, can I get you a taxi? Could you leave your keys? And if they were driving, my personal view is that I couldn't live with myself if that person drove a vehicle and hurt or kill somebody. I would break confidentiality for that. Other therapists may take a different view, Ken.
Yeah. And I guess we now go into that area where it becomes I guess tricky from the way that we're not given law that we have to follow. So in the instance you're speaking about, somebody that is clearly under the influence of alcohol, and they're going to leave your session and go and jump in their car. It is against the law, as you've said, but we're not called on to break confidentiality if somebody breaks the law. We are called on under certain legislation to break confidentiality. Yes. And this is where it becomes about your practice and how you run that, and the exclusions that you might put into your contract of when you might need to step in, when you might need to act, when you might need to break confidentiality. But just going back to the law, when you were speaking about drugs trafficking, it's up to us to have a look at drug trafficking legislation. Now, it doesn't mean we have to understand the intricacies of it, but we should be able to understand it to a point that we can explain it to a client. It's up to us to understand terrorism and money laundering regulations. Again, not that we have the intimate details of the law. I mean, if you find yourself in a situation where you feel, do I now need to break confidentiality? As Rory has said, you can seek advice from your ethical body. But so that we can explain it to a client and so that we can understand it ourselves. So if we don't have an understanding, and perchance a client says my partner is dealing cannabis on a corner, we might think we have to break confidentiality. It may be inappropriate breaking of confidentiality, and it can have ramifications for that person, for that client. It could cause harm to them for the ramifications that come in from that. So we need to tread carefully. Now, Rory has mentioned, and I'm going to mention this again, that he's prepared a handout for this episode, and this I think is one of the more important handouts. So if you're not in the practice of going over to our website and getting the handouts from each of the episodes, I suggest go and get this one, no matter what your level of practice. And the reason is it's got some really good useful links there. The terrorism hotline, Crime Stoppers, terrorism and money laundering regulation. There is a link to the government website where you can go and you can spend an hour looking over it so that you educate yourself on what that really means. Drug trafficking legislation. There is a link to the website. Once again, you can go and have a look at that and just inform yourself. There's a link to the Data Protection Act. Also BACP guidance on GDPR and the Equalities Act on the government website. So this is all UK based. If you're based in the UK, these are good links to have. These are really good links to have if you find yourself in a position of not knowing, wondering. These links are a great starting place.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, your own supervisor, go and speak to your supervisor if you're unsure. And, if you're unsure, speak to your ethical body, their ethics hub. And there's lots of information in different awarding bodies, ethical bodies, and you'll be able to go there and they'll be able to advise you. And I think I'd like to kind of, as we end this kind of topic, not leave people worrying too much. In the 20 years I've been practicing, I have to say that I've never come across any breaking of confidentiality for any laws, apart from the harm to self and harm to others, which is not a law; it's written into the contract. I think the therapists who break the law, break confidentiality because of the legislation are very few and far between. But I think when you do, that probably is a no going back to your client, because I think once the client finds out, because they'll work it out one way or another, I would imagine, then it would have an impact on the relationship. But we're bound by the law. We haven't got a choice.
Yeah, it's interesting when we speak on the podcast, Rory, how often we mention the word contract. I think if we take all of our podcast episodes and kind of used an artificial algorithm to look through it and find the word contract, is probably one of the most commonly uttered phrases. And the reason is it is so so important. It is the grounding to everything we do. And, we end this topic by saying, cover it in your contract so that the client knows. And maybe it's because it is well covered in contract, Rory, that it hasn't been mentioned. Because it lets the person know, don't go there, because it puts us in the position where we have to break confidentiality. No therapist wants to break confidentiality. It is the cornerstone of what we offer. But at the same time, no therapist wants there to be potential harm and danger to anybody under any circumstance. We need to educate ourselves. The links are in the handout. We need to build it into our contract. We need to make sure we have informed consent. That if anything should come of this, we're able to go back and evidence that this was agreed to and covered by the client. And if you want to get that handout, where do you go? Well, counsellingtutor.com. That is our website. When you get to counsellingtutor.com, look at the top menu and just click on podcasts and find episode 222. And you can download the handout on counselling and the law from right there within that page. It's free of charge. It is yours. And I hope that will be useful for you. Lots of really useful links. So as we kind of move away from the complexities that are the law, we go to a different kind of complexity when we speak about focus on self as being the heartbeat of our practice, and of course creating a safe environment for our clients. And again, this is something that takes consideration and thought, Rory.
It does. And it's one of the questions that comes up so often in our Facebook group. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find our group. We're a closed group, but our wonderful, lovely and loving moderation team will let you in. And you can join the party of thousands and thousands of like-minded people who are studying in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. There may be student colleagues, qualified colleagues, training colleagues, and supervisory colleagues, all debating the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And one of the questions that comes up a lot in that Facebook group is, how do you develop a safe emotional space? How do you, and this is the key thing, how do you, because it's within you are the driver of this, how do you develop that safe emotional space? And I think one of the ways that we think about that is about who we present ourselves as in the therapy room. Who are we in the therapy room? And I think part of that is to slightly leave the theories at the door. I think that when we sit in front of a client, yes, we're using a theory, but what we're doing is we're using ourselves. We are the vessel that we transmit ourselves through the theory. And I think sometimes it can be a difficult separation, certainly for those our student colleagues who are just starting in their practice, and they've got all these theories and they've been learning all these theories, but then just to sit in front of someone and as Martin Buber famously said, be I and thou.
Yep. That's it, isn't it? When the door closes, it is you and the client. And the essence of that is two human beings communicating. That's what it is. Two human beings communicating, whether that is in person, face to face, or in person via technology. It is two human beings communicating. And one of those human beings, the therapist, is present in a certain and professional way to facilitate what happens within that process. And yes, we have the theory that is a bubble that surrounds this. We have the counseling skills, which are present within the relationship in what we might say and when we might say it. But underlying all of that is the human being that is you, the heart of your practice, the true person that you are. And that is so important. We're shown in the research that the outcome of therapy is very heavily based on the relationship.
Mm.
And the relationship is you and that person, creating a threat-free environment. We've spoken about that before, and we do that with making sure they can't be overheard, and our contract, again, setting out the boundaries from our topic that we've previously discussed there. But inside of all of that, at the very core, if you look at the kernel, the bright, shining light, that's you. That is you. And this is why we have this topic of focus on self, because if our light is contaminated, if we are going in clouded and we're not able to fully be there and be present within that relationship, then I guess that is going to affect the relationship and the potential outcomes of that relationship.
Absolutely. And I want to introduce a new phrase that I've recently picked up in a book it's called Thinking for Clinicians by Donna M. Orange. And it draws from philosophers and the ideas of how we add philosophy into our practice, which I think is where our practice lives, in the very philosophical roots of ourselves and our clients. And it's a quote by Jonathan Lear, and it's called Radical Hope. And I think that when we work with clients, sometimes we give radical hope. And Jonathan Lear wrote about a quote by the chief of the Crow Nation, who said, when the buffalo went away and the hearts of my people fell to the ground, he said, he could not lift them up again. We could not lift them up again. And we see that so much in client work, where there's a loss, or there's a particular pain where someone can't lift their heart up again. And as a therapist, we produce, I think, radical hope. We're a bit of a beacon, a bit of a lighthouse. We may not be able to, and the client may not be able to, find their way in support, but at least we're making that offer. And I think it lies in our ability to see the other. And you're absolutely right, Ken. The research has come up time and time again. It talks about the dodo bird theory and the work at Scranton University of common factors, and it lives with us. And I think, to be honest, it's the biggest challenge. The theory, a lot of people think, the theory is so hard and so dense, whichever modality. But actually, I think the real challenge is being a human being and being that I and thou person. Oh yeah.
Oh, I love that. And you say it's the biggest challenge. For me, it has been the challenge that had its kernel in my counseling training. Mm-hmm. And it continues today, many, many years later, to be, I guess, no longer a challenge, but something that I enjoy. Mm-hmm. And that is personal development. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? That is a big question. Because am I going to define myself by my name, by my sex, by my work that I do, by my status in society, whatever it may be? Is that really who I am? Well, no. The who I am is that essence that lives within this body. I'm hitting it at the moment. I don't know if you can hear that.
Ooh, yes, I can hear that.
We're going to have to start
steady on, Ken. You might do yourself a damage there.
But it's that essence, that internal essence, and the world is all about looking externally, and self-development is about looking internally and learning who we are. And I do this, I guess, in service of clients, or have done it in service of clients, but I also do it in service of me, because the unexamined life is not worth living, as the saying goes.
Yes.
And as we learn who we are, we're able to kind of peel away the onions of the introjected values and the conditions of worth that have kind of created how we view the world and the reality that we look at. And that all falls away. The illusions fall away, in which we get to know our true selves, and then we get to be more of our true self within the relationship. And that's all that we're called on to do, is to be there, to not judge, and to be our true selves. If you're looking at person-centered therapy, we're called upon to exercise congruence, and that congruence is being true to who we really are. Not looking at another therapist and trying to do what they do, or trying to use the right skill at the right time and link it to the right theory, just being real, our true essence of self in a room with another person. And as you were speaking about the importance of that, Rory, I was thinking about how those that are held in captivity, that are held in isolation, the damage that happens from that, of not having another human being, even to listen, not even to talk back, even to listen, just having nobody there, how damaging that is to us as humans. Just another person caring to be there, caring to listen, even without uttering a word or using any skills or any theory, just caring to be there, already makes a massive, huge difference.
Yeah. Just sat in silence in a room with another.
Yeah.
Can do so much. And I think sometimes that's underestimated. We call it talking therapy. It is, but I think it's more than that. It's, as you say, Ken, it's connection. It's about us being the times I've sat in silence with another and just existed with that other person in that equal and present time. It's so powerful. In fact, some sessions, I think, were more powerful than when we were talking, because it just meant that two human beings were existing in the same place. It's not an easy concept to talk about, because it doesn't using the words doesn't really do justice to the feeling and the totality of how that existence plays out. It just doesn't. You cannot put it into words, can you, Ken?
No, it is. It's. No, I don't have words, and that's what that sigh is.
Yeah.
What is interesting, I have a passion project that you'll hear it at the beginning of our podcast, where I mention about my passion for counselling skills, and the passion project is called Counselling Skills Academy, and within that, I did a body of work with a fellow therapist. And we have around about 6 hours of recorded therapy sessions. And what's really, really interesting is that when that is evaluated, when it's looked at and kind of analyzed, less than 10% of that session is vocal reply or interaction or action from the therapist. So think about that. 90%,
Yes.
90% of the time, the therapist is not saying a single word, is silent. And if you think about the power of that, or what are we saying here? That only when the therapist is speaking are we creating process. Only when the therapist is speaking is healing taking place. It's the opposite. It is when the therapist is silent that this is happening. It's just being there with another human being. And the work we did was online. So it shouts loudly, it screams to the importance of self within the relationship.
Absolutely. And I think for those long-term listeners of the podcast, you may know that my grandson is a person with autism, and he's a non-verbal person. And he will come into the studio here when I'm not recording, although he did wander in a few weeks ago when we were recording. He kind of wanders in and he kind of sits in the workstation next to me, and he'll just sit, and we'll sit in relative silence together for maybe an hour. And then he'll look up at me, and you can feel he's got what he needed. He's got that connection. He doesn't need the conversation. He just needs to know he's in a safe space that he's seen in the world, and that's enough. That's enough. And sometimes, Ken, I do wonder if we put enough emphasis on this in training.
Oh, well, I mean, you've got personal development
Yeah, you have. Yeah,
training,
that's
and you're
fair
going to
enough,
have that. So I think it's pointed to, but I agree with you.
Yeah.
And I think post training, it's where it's very interesting.
Yes.
So, I mean, we run a CPD library for therapists that are qualified from counsellingtutor.com. And when I look through our content, it's academic in nature, or it's about presentations and how we may work with that, or it's about law, or the day-to-day running of a practice, note-taking, contracting, all of that kind of stuff. But it's interesting that there's not a lot. I mean, we do have stuff on self-care and personal development. We certainly do. But it's interesting when we look out of what we consider CPD, it's reading the latest information and being up to date with the latest legislation, as we started this podcast with. But where's the development of self? Where is that? And I'm not saying it's not there. It is there, and it does play a part. And I think that's a challenge to self, really, of what am I doing to develop the most important part of my practice? What am I doing to clarify that light that shines? What am I doing to be that significant other within that relationship? Apart from the theory and the skills and the legislation and the business of running the therapy, what am I doing? And I'll share what I'm doing. I'm moving to a simpler lifestyle. I'm moving away from. That's what I'm doing in my own life. The more I look at my personal journey and my personal development, the more I want to move away from the distractions. We got rid of our television, Rory. We got rid of our television. What am I doing? But it's all in service of that self. So yeah, wow. I love this topic. I love it. I think this focus on self is my favorite part of our podcast, Rory. It's what charges me. It
is. And it's interesting, isn't it? The kind of paths we take. You know, Ken's spoken about his path and selling his TV and moving to a simpler life. I've got kind of quite lost in philosophy, and one of the interesting things about philosophy, always asks more questions than there are answers. You know, and I found that as a practitioner and a human being to be a sucker. Certainly as I move into later life, to try and make sense of, you know, why am I here? The kind of existential questions: who am I and why am I here? And I have to say, I'm no nearer answering them than when I started, but at least I'm making the effort.
Yeah,
I'm asking the questions every day.
Yes, it's the seeking, Rory, and that's the thing, you know.
Yes.
I would love to meet the person who says, "Well, I'm done with all the personal development stuff. I'm now personally developed. Moving on to my next project, which is we don't get there.
Building a shed.
There is no getting there. There is no getting there.
No.
It's all about the journey and that focus. What a great topic, Rory. Thank you for bringing that focus on self. I could go on.
Yes.
For a lot longer, but we have more topics to cover, because we're now going to move on to our next area, which is practice matters. And this is where you spoke with Amy Launder, who has done quite a bit of work with Counselling Tutor, a good Counselling Tutor friend, around limited timed counselling, Rory.
Absolutely. She recorded a lecture for our CPD library on time-limited counselling, both in the National Health Service and also in general practice. And she had some interesting thoughts, and this is what she had to say. And we welcome Amy Launder back again, one of our visiting lecturers, who's done a fantastic lecture for us in the Counsellor CPD library on time-limited counselling in the National Health Service. So Amy, welcome back.
Thank you for having me back.
So I think it's an interesting topic, isn't it? Why is, I mean, I guess the first question is, why is therapy time limited in the National Health Service?
Yeah, I mean, well, the main reason is the funding of it, the finances of it. There's so many people who want to access therapy on the NHS or for free in some way via a charity, and there's only so many therapists and so much funding to go around. So time limited therapy was a way that services could see as many people as possible, but it's not ideal because obviously we want longer term open-ended therapy for people. So
yeah, I think you make a very interesting point, because you talked about the NHS, but of course there's lots of agencies who may offer 6 or 12 session blocks because of funding. So for people listening to this lecture, it may not just be for the NHS, it may be for those who are just working for an agency who offer, or an EAP, and an employment assistance program, who offer blocks of therapy in a time limited way. So how does that kind of inform the way you work, knowing it's not open-ended?
Yeah, well, what's very interesting is that a lot of counsellors are not trained in time-limited therapy. The modality that they're trained in is more open-ended. So it's very tricky when you're coming into a placement, let's say, or to a job that is time-limited. So it does take some adjusting. One of the main things is structure. So each individual session, but also over the 6 or 12 sessions, to have that kind of structure of assessment, treatment, and then closing down, and also referring onwards as well.
Yes, and I think you've started a very interesting train of thought, certainly for me, and I hope the listener out there as well. Assessment, that's crucial, isn't it, when you're doing any form of therapy? But I'm wondering, is it more crucial if you're doing time-limited therapy, and if so, why?
Yeah, I think it's definitely more crucial as a way of honing in on what the client needs to work on in those 6 sessions, because with open-ended therapy you can be much more client-led and kind of, whatever's going on that week for the client. In time-limited therapy there is much more, there's a goal. What are we going to achieve in 6 weeks? What is the client going to work on? So it is much less what's going on each week for the client, and much more kind of what is it that we're working on every week for 6 weeks.
And do you think that some modalities of therapy suit time limited better than others?
Definitely. I mean, there are some modalities of therapy that were designed specifically for time limited therapy. So there's the dynamic interpersonal therapy, and another one is IPT. I can't specifically remember it, but it's in the lecture if you watch it.
Okay.
But they were specifically designed for short-term time-limited therapy, so mainly for 16-week sessions, but those were specifically designed for that. CBT obviously is designed for short-term work, but most modalities can be adapted for short-term work. I mean, one of the jobs that I had before going full-time private practice was supporting placement students who were working in the NHS service that I was working in. And we had students with all sorts of modalities, all sorts of training, who worked with us and worked in short-term therapy. So
it's just a case of sometimes adapting it. And I guess that, we know from the research that client preferences and client motivation gives us, gives the clients the best outcomes in therapy. Do you think, and I'm putting you on the spot here a bit, do you think that a time-limited environment may suit some clients better than others?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, there was definitely, when I was working in the NHS service, there's definitely some clients who are very goal-oriented, and they're very, they're very solution-focused, very goal-oriented, and they only want to focus on one specific problem. Whereas others who are much more, they want to explore and they want to have the space and time to explore. It doesn't quite fit their needs, but because that's all maybe they could access because of finances or something, you would see them repeatedly coming back to the service, which they're obviously allowed to do, but it doesn't necessarily work because then you're starting again with someone different each time. So yeah, it just depends on the person, I guess.
Yes, it's the Achilles heel, isn't it? I mean, I've spoken to colleagues who've worked in a time limited environment, and they talk about the revolving door of clients who just keep turning up and turning up and turning up, and where a longer term engagement may be useful. I think we talked about assessment. Is there any presentations where a therapist working in a time-limited practice may say, I think maybe I'll refer you on for longer-term therapy? Are there any kind of flags where we would say, I don't think this is something that can be worked within 6, 12 or 16 sessions.
Yes, definitely. So this is a conversation we had to have with all of our placement students, is clients presenting with trauma, with, anything like that it's not designed, like short-term therapy is not designed to work with that. I mean, the whole IAPS NHS service was designed to get people back into work. It was a government initiative, so it was for low-level stress, anxiety, depression, not designed for trauma at all. And the danger with time-limited therapy is opening up something like a trauma or childhood trauma and not having time to safely close it down again. So what we would do with clients like that is we would explore how the trauma is impacting their life in the day-to-day here and now, but then we would refer them on for longer-term open-ended work to deal with the actual trauma itself.
Yes, and I think that's really, really important, isn't it? And I think that's a strong message for people maybe working not in the NHS, but in time limited, is in the assessment that, is there a danger to the clients here? Because it's terribly dangerous and depowering, and you could argue abusive to clients to open them up in 6 sessions and then just cast them adrift again.
Yeah, definitely. And thinking about onward referrals from session 1, no matter kind of how, if it was 6 sessions, 12 sessions or 16 sessions, thinking from the assessment stage throughout kind of what other services are out there that would benefit this client, whether it is other ongoing counselling services or more social support or, something like that, social services involvement and that kind of thing. It's building up a network in your head or, on paper of what other services are there in the local area that can support clients with these different presentations. Yeah,
so all good therapists have a referral book and a list of contacts, and I guess all seasoned therapists would be having in the back of their mind, does this client need any more support? How am I going to map that support as we come to the end? In time limited therapy, are assessment tools important, do you think? Using things like Core 10 to assess where clients are, and clients self-assess, don't they, in that important?
Definitely. I mean, I know all NHS counselling services, but most charity funded services will require you to use those kinds of assessment tools. So where I worked in the NHS, we used the PHQ-9, which is a depression scale, the GAD-7, which is the anxiety, and there's one question, Core 10, which is the suicidal question, as well as all sorts of employment questions, social adjustment questionnaires. It's kind of an amalgamation of lots of different things, and we actually use that every single week with the client. I know I've worked when I was training on different placements in charities where you only use them in first session and last session, or first, middle and last session, and it's very useful in terms of guiding each session, especially if you've got a client who's not used to therapy, maybe it's their first time, they're not really opening up, they don't really know where to go in each session. You can use their answers to maybe guide a bit of psychoeducation. If their sleep answers are really, show poor sleep hygiene, you can kind of explain a bit more about that to them and that kind of thing. But actually, the main reason that you're required to do them is for funding, to show that the treatment is working, not for each client, but just on an overall basis. It's to kind of keep the services going.
Yes, and I guess the wonderful NHS is funded by us, the taxpayer, and it's the mantra of value for money. Although I have to acknowledge there'll be some listeners listening who will be wincing at the notion of having to fill forms in at every session. In terms of supervision in time limited therapy, because I'm thinking if you've got a 6-week engagement with the client, you may only be able to bring the client maybe once, maybe twice to supervision. What other support would a time limited therapist get or look for given that supervision cycle?
Yeah, well, so I can only speak to places where I've worked. So the service that I worked for that worked with the NHS, because it is a private company that the NHS kind of farms out the counselling service to, they did group supervision twice a month. So you're right, you only get kind of once or twice to present a client, but every therapist had access to their supervisor between sessions. So if it was a case of risk or anxiety in the therapist, especially if they're a new therapist, they could phone the supervisor, email the supervisor, and that kind of thing. They also had a team leader, which was my role. So we were there for more administrative support. So if they got allocated a client that didn't seem appropriate for counselling or something like that, then we would deal with that. So they had a lot of support around them. And I'm sure other services would have some kind of similar setup where you've got access to the supervisor outside of sessions.
So it sounds to me like time-limited therapy requires an ecosystem of support, not just the time-limited session or even the use of core or other assessment tools, but also a support system for the therapist and the client because of the limited engagement.
Yeah, it's definitely it feels very intense because you feel like you have to do so much within 6 sessions. What I realized, which was really interesting when I started doing private practice alongside time limited therapy, was how much was being done in those 6 sessions that I didn't realize was being done. So with private clients, they would maybe say, at session 30, oh, I remember in the first session you said this, and it's just clicked how that works. So actually you realize you're planting a lot of seeds in the 6 sessions that then come to fruition later on. So what I would often say to a lot of the placement students who were doing time limited therapy was to calm the self down, not feel like you have to be doing all the time, but to be and to know that you're helping, even if it doesn't feel like it within those 6 sessions.
Yes. And also you mentioned things like psychoeducation, sleep hygiene. I would imagine things like sort of sensible use of alcohol may come into that as well. So there seems to be a very strong educational strand within at least NHS time limited therapy.
Yes, and what I found just from my own experience with NHS therapy was that a lot of clients who were coming through, it was their first ever experience of therapy. So there was a strong element of psychoeducation because it was stuff that was completely new to them. Like as a therapist, it feels like pretty basic stuff because we've been learning it for so long. But for clients who've never had therapy or never known anyone who's been in therapy, it is all new stuff, and it is very important stuff for them to kind of build foundations from. So kind of don't underestimate the impact of psychoeducation with clients, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something for general practice as well. I think that psychoeducation is becoming more a modality. It's more of a modality-free intervention, really, isn't it? Because it's just really useful information for clients in certain circumstances. As we come to the end of this interview, our time together, what do you hope that those who watch your lecture will take away from it?
I hope that there'll be less of a kind of panic around time-limited therapy, that there's more, that placement students especially who are having to adjust from what they've been trained to do to what actually happens in practice, that they'll see more use in time-limited therapy, because I remember being on training and feeling like time-limited therapy was an awful way to practice, but actually seeing how much can be done is very rewarding.
Well, I think this is a timely and excellent lecture, Amy. I think the reality is for a lot of our colleagues working in the world of counselling and psychotherapy, that a lot of engagements will be time limited, even in private practice, because people may only have so much funding to pay for therapy. So I think it's really, really useful to understand that and to understand the kind of advantages and the constrictions of it. So Amy Launder, so glad you joined us. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Amy Launder. Thank you again to you, Rory, for hosting these really interesting interviews. And if you're interested in learning more about limited time counselling. We have a CPD library for qualified practitioners. You can get in more information about how to join that at counsellingtutor.com. This has been episode 222 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started with Counselling Foundations and Counselling and the Law. I kind of myself looked at the different legislations that underpinned counselling practice, certainly here in the UK. Focused on self, we had a quite a nice meander through the world of existential personal development, and we talked about developing a safe emotional space for clients, and we finished with an interview with Amy Launder, who talks about time-limited counselling. And as always, and especially at this time in the world, stay grounded and stay safe.